All right. Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. And today, we're tackling something that I think we've all struggled with at some point. Communication in relationships. You guys sent in some really interesting stuff about how certain communication styles can really trip people up when it comes to love, friendships, family, you name it. I'm super excited to dive into this with our expert and see what we can learn.
I think you'll find this deep dive quite enlightening. Just understanding these patterns is often the first step towards positive change.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What are the big communication no-nos that we should watch out for?
Well, based on all the research you send over, we can really break it down into three main categories. Passive aggressive, and that sneaky one, passive aggressive. Each one has its own unique way of derailing communication.
Okay, so let's unpack these one by one. Let's start with passive communication. How does that usually play out in a relationship?
So, someone who communicates passively tends to put everyone else's needs before their own, you know? And they often struggle to express their own thoughts and feelings directly. That can leave them feeling unheard, misunderstood, and even resentful over time.
Oh, I totally get that. I think we've all been in situations where we've kind of held back from saying what we really think, especially when things get a little, heated. So what happens when this becomes a pattern? Like, what are the long-term consequences of keeping things bottled up like that?
Well, it can really chip away at a person's sense of self-worth, like
Yeah.
their opinions and feelings don't matter. And it creates a real imbalance in the relationship. The passive communicator might start feeling taken advantage of, like their needs are invisible to their partner.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like you're slowly disappearing in the relationship. Now let's swing over to the other end of the spectrum. Aggressive communication. What are the telltale signs of that style?
Aggressive communication is really all about control, dominating the conversation. People who communicate this way often interrupt others, criticize, blame, and they might even resort to, like, raising their voices, using sarcasm or threats to try to get their point across.
Oh, that sounds intense.
Mhm.
It's like they're always ready for battle. But does aggressive communication always come from a place of, like, wanting to be mean?
Not necessarily. Sometimes it's a learned behavior, like maybe they grew up in a family where the loudest voice always won. Or they might have been hurt in the past and are now trying to protect themselves by, well, being overly assertive. But regardless of the reason, it can be incredibly damaging to the relationship.
Yeah, it's definitely a communication killer. It's not just what you say, but how you say it. Now, let's tackle that tricky one, passive-aggressive communication. It always feels like there's this hidden message lurking beneath the surface. What's the deal with that style?
It's definitely subtle, but it's just as harmful as the other styles. Passive aggressive behavior is all about expressing anger or frustration indirectly. Instead of addressing the issue head on, the person might use sarcasm, sulking, or, the classic silent treatment to get their point across.
This silent treatment. It's so frustrating. It's like this big elephant in the room, but no one wants to talk about it. Can you give us an example of how passive-aggressive communication might show up in a relationship?
Sure. Imagine a couple's arguing about chores, right? Instead of saying, hey, I'm feeling overwhelmed, can you help me out more? The passive aggressive person might agree to do the dishes, but then intentionally do a shoddy job or leave them half finished.
Oh, I see. It's like a way of getting back at the other person without actually having to confront them directly. But that just breeds resentment, right?
Right.
And it definitely doesn't solve the problem.
Exactly. Now, aside from these broader communication styles, the research also points to some specific behaviors that can signal trouble brewing in a relationship.
Like what? What should we be looking out for?
Well, things like constant blaming, stonewalling, and using those you statements can be real red flags.
Okay, I understand blaming can be bad, but are there ever times when, it's important to clearly point out someone's role in a problem?
That's a great point. It's really about the way you go about it. If you're constantly pointing fingers and saying, you always do this or you never do that, it just puts the other person on the defensive. And that shuts down communication. Instead, try focusing on I statements. Explain how their actions make you feel. For example, I feel hurt when you do this, or I feel disrespected when you say that.
So it's not about letting someone off the hook, but finding a way to communicate your needs without attacking the other person.
Exactly. Now, stonewalling is another big one to watch out for. It's basically just refusing to engage in the conversation, like completely shutting down emotionally or physically. And that leaves the other partner feeling totally abandoned and unheard.
Oof. It seems like that would just make things worse, wouldn't it? Like just escalate the conflict.
It definitely can. And then we have those you statements. You know, it might seem like a small thing, but constantly freezing complaints in terms of you just puts the other person on the defensive. Like, you always leave your clothes on the floor. Try shifting to I statements. For example, I get frustrated when I trip over clothes on the floor. It can make a world of difference in how your message is received.
So we've talked about the general communication styles and some specific behaviors to watch out for. But what about like the role of emotions? How do our feelings influence the way we communicate, especially during those heated moments?
That's a key piece of this whole communication puzzle. Couples often fall into these predictable negative cycles, particularly the protesting withdrawing dynamic.
Oh, tell me more about that. What does that look like?
Okay, so in this pattern, one partner becomes increasingly demanding or critical, like they're constantly protesting, while the other partner just withdraws and shuts down emotionally. And the more one protests, the more the other withdraws. It creates this vicious cycle that just keeps escalating the conflict.
It's like a dance, but not a very fun one. Yeah. What do you think drives these patterns? Like, why do we fall into these traps?
I think a lot of it boils down to unmet needs, you know? It's usually happening on an unconscious level. The protesting partner might be craving connection and attention, while the withdrawing partner might be feeling overwhelmed and needing space.
So it's not about one person being right and the other being wrong, but rather understanding the deeper emotional needs that are driving the behavior.
Exactly. And these patterns can sometimes manifest as controlling behaviors, you know, things like jealousy, micromanaging, or constantly bringing up old arguments.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes control can come from a place of insecurity. But couldn't it also be about power? Like wanting to exert power over the other person rather than protecting themselves?
You're absolutely right. Control isn't always about fear. Sometimes it's a way of manipulating and dominating the other person. And in those cases, it's super important to recognize the harmful nature of these behaviors and address them head on.
Makes sense. And then, of course, we have to talk about verbal abuse, which takes things to a whole other level of seriousness.
Absolutely. Verbal abuse is a form of relationship violence. It can include name calling, constant criticism, humiliation, manipulation, and even threats. It's about using words as weapons to control and demean the other person.
It's so important to remember that while disagreements are a normal part of any relationship, verbal abuse is never okay. It crosses the line from healthish conflict into something far more damaging and hurtful.
Exactly. And the first step is recognizing the patterns. That can empower someone to seek help and break free from that cycle of abuse.
Wow, this has been incredibly insightful. I think the big takeaway here is how important it is to be aware of our communication styles and how they impact our relationships.
It's about creating awareness, not making people feel overwhelmed. You know, even small shifts in how we communicate can make a world of difference.
I completely agree. So as you reflect on all this, we'll leave you with this thought. Take a moment to consider your own communication patterns. Are there any areas where you could be more assertive, more empathetic, or just more mindful of the words you're choosing? It's a journey, and every step towards healthier communication brings you closer to more fulfilling and loving relationships. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.